Smoke and fire filled the sky, turning the battlefield into a graveyard of metal and bodies. Lieutenant Eric Voss moved through the wreckage, his rifle raised, his breathing steady despite the chaos around him. The war between humans and the Zyran Empire had been raging for years, and today was supposed to be a victory. Instead, it was a massacre. His squad had been ambushed, their dropship shot down before they could evacuate. Now, Eric was alone, searching for survivors. The ground beneath him was littered with the dead, both human and Zyran soldiers. Sparks flickered from broken machinery, and in the distance, a collapsed war mech lay half-buried under rubble. Eric heard the faint crackle of his radio, but the signal was weak. The command center was too far, and he doubted anyone was coming for him. Then he heard something else, a sound barely noticeable beneath the howling wind and the distant echoes of battle. A breath. Weak. Struggling. Eric turned sharply, his weapon aimed in the direction of the noise. He stepped carefully over broken armor plates and shattered helmets until he reached a pile of debris. Beneath the wreckage, a figure lay motionless. A Zyran. His grip tightened on the trigger. The Zyran were brutal, merciless warriors who saw humans as inferior. He had fought them for years, watched them slaughter his people without hesitation. And yet, as he looked closer, he realized this one was different. Smaller, younger, a female soldier, barely alive. Her armor was cracked, blood dripping from a wound on her side. Her breathing was ragged, her four-fingered hands twitching weakly. Zyran didn't leave their wounded behind, not unless they considered them unworthy of survival. Eric hesitated. He should walk away. This was an enemy who, if given the chance, might kill him the moment she recovered. But something about the way she was left here, discarded like trash, made his stomach twist. She was whispering something in her language, her voice barely audible. He couldn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. She didn't want to die. A sharp beep sounded in the distance. Eric's instincts screamed at him. Enemy patrol drone. If it scanned him and found him aiding a Zyran, he'd be marked as a traitor. The drone's red light flickered across the battlefield, searching for movement. Eric made his choice. Cursing under his breath, he crouched down and lifted the alien girl into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, but her body was burning with fever. She flinched but didn't resist. She didn't have the strength to. Eric moved quickly, keeping low, weaving through the wreckage as the drone passed overhead. The sound of its scanners hummed through the air, but he remained hidden. A few agonizing moments later, it moved on. He had no idea why he just risked his life for an enemy, but he wasn't going to let her die here. 2. The underground outpost was small, built into the ruins of an old human colony. It was nothing more than a temporary shelter, hidden from enemy scans. Eric laid the Zyran girl down on a metal cot and grabbed his medkit. She was barely conscious, her breathing shallow. He pulled off her broken armor, revealing dark blue skin covered in bruises and cuts. Zyran biology was different from humans, but blood loss was universal. He cleaned the wound, pressing a clotting patch against it. She flinched, her golden eyes snapping open. She reacted instantly, grabbing his wrist with surprising strength. Her fingers dug into his skin. And for a moment, Eric thought she was going to try and kill him. But then her grip weakened, and she fell back against the cot, exhausted. "You're going to die if you don't let me help," he muttered. He wasn't sure if she understood, but she didn't stop him. As he worked, he studied her face. Zyran were supposed to be monstrous, but up close, she looked almost human. Different, yes. Strange, definitely, but not a monster. The radio crackled again. This time, a voice came through. "Lieutenant Voss, report." Eric hesitated. He looked at the Zyran girl, then at the radio. If he reported her, she'd be taken as a prisoner. And prisoners of war didn't last long. His gut told him to stay silent. "I'm alive," he said finally. "No other survivors. A lie. One that could get him court-martialed. But he didn't care. The girl stirred, her golden eyes locking onto his. She didn't trust him. He didn't trust her. But for now, they were both trapped in the same war. And neither of them wanted to die. The underground shelter was quiet except for the soft beeping of a damaged console and the distant hum of a ventilation fan struggling to keep the stale air circulating. Eric sat on a metal crate across from the injured Zyran girl, his rifle resting within reach. He had treated her wounds as best as he could, but she was still weak, her breathing uneven. Her golden eyes flickered open, scanning her surroundings before landing on him. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Eric didn't know what to say. He wasn't even sure if she could understand him. The Zyran language was strange, filled with clicks and sharp syllables, but he had heard it enough times on the battlefield to recognize some words. She was still too weak to fight, but the tension in her body told him that if she had the strength, she would. She didn't trust him. And why would she? Humans and Zyran had been at war for years. He had seen what her kind did to human soldiers, what they did to civilians. If the roles were reversed, if he were the one lying wounded in a Zyran camp, he wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes. The logical thing to do was turn her in. The radio on his belt was still active, waiting for him to report back. All he had to do was say the word, and a team would arrive to collect her. But Eric didn't reach for the radio. He had already lied once to keep her presence a secret, and he wasn't sure why. Maybe it was because she had been abandoned, just like him. Maybe it was because, for the first time, he was looking at a Zyran who wasn't holding a weapon against his people. The girl tried to sit up but winced in pain, her hand pressing against her injured side. Eric tensed, expecting her to attack. But instead, she simply stared at him, her expression unreadable. Slowly, she raised her hand and pointed at herself. Sally. Her voice was quiet, hoarse, but there was a strength behind it. Eric realized she was telling him her name. He hesitated, then tapped his chest. Eric. For a moment, there was silence. Then, almost imperceptibly, she gave a slight nod. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Still, the air between them remained thick with uncertainty. Eric stood and moved toward a small storage locker, pulling out a ration pack. He tossed it toward her cot, and she flinched, her body tensing as if expecting an attack. When nothing happened, she cautiously reached for the package, her fingers brushing over the material. Zyran soldiers were trained to survive with minimal resources, but she was starving. He could see it in the way she hesitated before tearing into the food. She took a bite, then froze. Eric smirked. Tastes like cardboard, huh? She didn't respond, but the slight wrinkle of her nose told him everything he needed to know. The tension in the room eased, if only slightly. Hours passed, and neither of them spoke much. Eric worked on repairing his broken communication device, while Sally rested, conserving what little strength she had. He could feel her watching him, studying his movements just as he was studying hers. They were two enemies forced into the same space, trying to figure out what came next. Then, the silence was broken by a sharp beep from Eric's radio. Lieutenant Voss, report. His stomach twisted. He knew this was coming. He glanced at Sally. She had tensed, her muscles coiled like a spring. She understood that voice. She knew what would happen if he answered. Eric picked up the radio, pressing the button. Still no sign of survivors, he said, his voice steady. I'm moving toward the extraction point. There was a pause. Then, copy that. Command wants all remaining soldiers back at base. If you find any Zyran alive, eliminate them. No prisoners. Eric clenched his jaw. He glanced at Sally again. She was watching him closely, waiting for his reaction. Understood, he replied, before shutting the radio off. She exhaled slowly, her body relaxing just a fraction. He wasn't sure if she fully trusted him yet, but she knew one thing: he hadn't turned her in. The next few days were a strange routine of silence and cautious observation. Sally's strength slowly returned, and Eric noticed the way her posture shifted from vulnerability to quiet determination. She still didn't trust him, but she no longer looked at him with pure hostility. One evening, as Eric sat sharpening his knife, Sally reached for a small piece of metal scrap from the floor. She studied it for a moment, then began etching something into the dirt. Eric frowned, leaning forward to see. It was a symbol, a mark of the Zyran military. She pointed at it, then made a slicing motion across it before shaking her head. Eric narrowed his eyes. "You're not with them." Sally hesitated, then nodded slowly. He frowned. That didn't make sense. The Zyran Empire didn't abandon their own Unless. Realization hit him. "They left you because you wouldn't follow orders," he muttered. Sally didn't confirm or deny it, but the look in her eyes told him everything. She wasn't just abandoned. She had been betrayed. That changed everything. Eric exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He had spent years fighting her kind, believing every Zyran was the same, merciless, obedient soldiers who followed their empire without question. But now he was looking at one who had chosen not to kill. And for that, she had been left to die. The realization unsettled him more than he expected. He stood and grabbed his rifle, moving toward the entrance of the shelter. He needed air. As he reached the door, he paused. "Get some rest," he said without looking back. "We're both going to need it." He wasn't sure why he said we. The night was quiet, too quiet. Eric sat near the entrance of the underground shelter, his rifle resting across his lap. He had been a soldier long enough to know that silence on a battlefield was never a good thing. It meant something was coming. Inside, Sally sat against the wall, still recovering from her wounds. Over the past few days, her strength had improved, but she wasn't at full capacity yet. She wasn't a threat to him anymore, not in the way she had been before. Eric wasn't sure when the shift had happened, but he no longer saw her as just an enemy. She was something else now. She had proven she wasn't like the others. The Zyran Empire had abandoned her because she refused to follow orders, because she had chosen not to kill civilians. It was a rare thing, the Zyran with a conscience. Eric had fought her kind long enough to know they valued strength above all else. Mercy was seen as weakness. That was why they had left her to die. He exhaled, adjusting the strap of his rifle. His gut told him to move, to find a safer location. They had been in this shelter too long. If the Zyran were looking for her, if his own people were looking for him, it was only a matter of time before someone found them. The radio on his belt crackled to life. He stiffened, lifting it slowly. "Lieutenant Voss, respond." His fingers tightened around the device. It was his commanding officer. He hadn't checked in since he had told them there were no survivors. He had kept Sally hidden, knowing that if they found out, she would be executed on the spot. He hesitated before pressing the button. "Go ahead." "We intercepted a Zyran transmission. They're searching for a traitor among their ranks. If you see any Zyran still breathing, you know the protocol. Kill on sight." Eric's gaze flickered toward Sally. She was watching him carefully, her golden eyes sharp. She knew something was wrong. "Understood," he said, his voice steady. He clicked the radio off and stood, his instincts screaming at him. Something was wrong. Then he heard it, a faint sound, almost unnoticeable beneath the hum of the ventilation system, a rhythmic beeping. His heart stopped. He knew that sound. Tracking beacon. Eric moved fast. He dropped to one knee, grabbing Sally's arm and pulling her forward. She gasped at the sudden movement, her body tensing. "Did they tag you?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. She frowned, confused. He ran his hands over her armor, searching for any embedded device. Nothing. Then realization hit him. He reached down to his belt, to the radio. His own Dan radio. The moment he had responded, they had traced his location. He cursed, throwing the radio across the room. It shattered against the wall, but it was too late. If they had a lock on his position, The enemy was already on their way. A distant explosion shook the ground beneath them. Dust fell from the ceiling. Sally's eyes widened. Eric grabbed his rifle and slung it over his shoulder. "We have to move. Now." She didn't argue. She pushed herself to her feet, still weak but determined. Eric reached for his pack, grabbing whatever supplies he could carry. The moment they stepped outside, they would be exposed. He needed a plan. The next explosion was closer. The walls trembled. Then the first gunfire erupted. Eric barely had time to react before the shelter's entrance was blasted open. The force of the explosion threw him backward, pain exploding in his ribs as he hit the ground. His ears rang, his vision blurred. Through the smoke, armored figures stormed in. Zyran shock troopers, tall, ruthless, and heavily armed. Sally was already moving. Despite her injuries, she grabbed a discarded plasma pistol and fired. The first shot hit a trooper in the chest, sending him sprawling. The second missed, but it forced the others to take cover. Eric rolled onto his stomach, grabbing his rifle. He fired 3 quick bursts, dropping another enemy. The confined space of the shelter worked to their advantage. The Zyran couldn't use heavy explosives without collapsing the entire structure. But Eric knew they wouldn't need to. They had the numbers. "We can't stay here," he shouted over the gunfire. Sally didn't answer, but she understood. She moved toward him, staying low as more plasma rounds flew past them. Eric pulled a smoke grenade from his belt and yanked the pin. Thick, gray smoke filled the room instantly, cutting off visibility. "Go," he ordered. They sprinted toward the exit, Eric firing blindly behind them to keep the enemy pinned. The outside air was cold and sharp against his skin. They had emerged into the ruins of an old city, its broken buildings stretching into the darkness. There was no time to think. Eric grabbed Sally's wrist and pulled her toward the wreckage of an abandoned transport ship. If they could get to the vehicle bay, they might find something to escape in. Behind them, the Zyran soldiers regrouped. The smoke wouldn't keep them back for long. Eric led Sally through the rubble, weaving between fallen structures and burnt-out vehicles. Then, a red laser sight flashed across his vision. Sniper. He reacted instantly, shoving Sally down as the shot rang out. The bullet tore past him, missing by inches. He hit the ground hard, rolling behind a broken wall. His heart pounded. "We need to split up," he said, breathing heavily. "They're tracking my movements. You head east. I'll draw them away." Sally's eyes narrowed. She hesitated. "Go," he snapped. This time, she didn't argue. She turned and ran, disappearing into the shadows. Eric took a deep breath and moved in the opposite direction. He could hear the Zyran soldiers communicating through their radios. They were closing in. He sprinted toward an overturned truck, using the wreckage for cover. His rifle was running low on ammo. He had maybe 2 magazines left. Then he heard something worse than gunfire. The deep mechanical hum of an approaching dropship. Reinforcements. He gritted his teeth. They had to end this fight now. His eyes scanned the battlefield, searching for an advantage. Then he saw it. A fuel tank, half buried beneath the wreckage. If he could lure the Zyran close enough. He took a deep breath, steadied his aim, and fired. The explosion lit up the night, fire and metal erupting into the sky. The shockwave knocked Eric backward, his ears ringing. He scrambled to his feet, using the chaos to escape. Somewhere in the distance, he saw a figure moving toward him. For a split second, he raised his rifle, until he recognized the silhouette. Sally. She had come back for him. She grabbed his arm, pulling him forward. "Come," she said, her voice strained but firm. Eric didn't argue. Together, they disappeared into the ruins, the flames of the battlefield burning behind them. The ruins stretched endlessly before them, jagged remains of once thriving human colonies now reduced to dust and metal skeletons. The night sky, covered in thick clouds, provided some cover, but Eric knew it wouldn't be enough. The Zirin were still hunting them. The dropship overhead had deployed scanning drones, their red lights flickering as they moved through the wreckage, searching for any sign of life. Every second counted. Eric kept low, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands. His body ached from the earlier explosion, and his ribs burned with each breath. Sally moved beside him, her steps quiet, her eyes scanning their surroundings. Despite her injuries, she was adapting quickly, her instincts sharp. Eric could tell she was used to being the hunter, not the hunted. "We can't outrun them forever," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Sally glanced at him, then looked toward the remains of a collapsed building nearby. She motioned for him to follow. He didn't argue. They slipped inside, maneuvering through the rubble until they found cover behind a broken wall. Through the cracks, Eric watched as Zirin soldiers moved through the streets, their weapons raised, their movements precise. They were sweeping the area carefully, methodically. "They won't stop," Eric muttered. "They want you dead." Sally exhaled sharply, frustration flickering across her face. She knew that. This was her own kind chasing her. There was no chance for mercy. If they caught her, they would execute her without hesitation. Eric's grip tightened on his rifle. "We need allies." Sally's gaze flickered toward him. He nodded. "There are human survivors out there. Fighters. Rebels. Not everyone follows orders blindly. And I don't believe for a second that you're the only Zirin who turned against your own." For a moment, she said nothing. Her fingers curled into fists as if she was struggling with the idea. Then, finally, she spoke. "I know where to go." Eric raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" She hesitated, then nodded. "But dangerous." He smirked, adjusting his rifle strap. "Yeah. Well, I don't think we're getting out of this alive if we don't take some risks." They moved quickly, weaving through the wreckage, avoiding enemy patrols as best as they could. They had no vehicles, no heavy weapons, and barely any supplies. But Eric knew one thing: humans had survived worse. He had survived worse. If there was a way out, he was going to find it. Hours passed as they moved through the ruins, keeping low and silent. The distant sound of engines echoed through the night. Zirin search teams were everywhere. They were running out of time. Then they reached it, a hidden settlement, buried beneath the remains of an old industrial zone. It wasn't much. Scrap metal buildings, makeshift barricades, old human and alien technology repurposed into weapons. But it was alive. Fires burned in barrels. Figures moved in the shadows. Humans, dressed in scavenged armor. And not just humans. Eric spotted them immediately, Zirin. Not soldiers, not the ones who had been hunting them. These Zirin wore damaged armor, their faces weary, their eyes sharp. Sally tensed beside him. "You trust them?" Eric asked quietly. She hesitated before nodding. "They are like me, left behind." That was all Eric needed to hear. They stepped forward, and instantly weapons were raised. A dozen rifles pointed at them, voices shouting orders. Eric didn't move. He kept his hands up, his expression calm. "We're not your enemy," he called out. "We're here to fight the ones who left you behind." A tall human stepped forward, his armor mismatched, his face scarred. His eyes flickered between Eric and Sally. "You brought a Zirin here." Eric didn't flinch. "She's not with them. She's one of us now." Silence followed. Then a Zirin woman stepped forward, her gaze sharp as she studied Sally. A quiet exchange passed between them in their native tongue. Sally spoke quickly, urgently. Whatever she said, it worked. The Zirin woman looked back at the human leader and nodded. "They're telling the truth." Slowly, the weapons lowered. The tension didn't disappear, but it shifted. Eric exhaled, relaxing slightly. They weren't out of danger, but at least for now, they weren't alone. Inside the settlement, Eric learned the truth. These people, humans and Zirin alike, had been abandoned by their own sides. Soldiers, Engineers, survivors of battles no one cared to remember. Some had been betrayed, some had simply been forgotten. And they all had one thing in common. They wanted revenge. Eric stood before the gathered fighters, his mind racing. This wasn't just a group of survivors. This was an army waiting to be unleashed. They just needed a leader. He looked at Sally. She was speaking quietly with the other Zyran, their voices tense but determined. Then she turned to Eric. "They will fight," she said simply, "if we lead." Eric nodded. The Zyran Empire thought they could erase the ones they abandoned. The human command thought they could silence those who didn't follow orders. They were both wrong. This war wasn't over. It was just beginning. The night was alive with the hum of approaching warships. The ground trembled as distant explosions lit up the sky, turning the dark clouds into a battlefield of fire and smoke. Eric stood on a ridge overlooking the enemy stronghold, his rifle gripped tightly in his hands. This was it, the final stand. Behind him, humans and Zyrans stood together, an army forged from the forgotten. The abandoned, the ones both sides had left behind. They had no reinforcements coming, no backup waiting to save them if things went wrong. This was all or nothing. Sally stood beside him, her golden eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. She had changed since the first time he had found her bleeding in the ruins. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a warrior, a leader. Eric exhaled, steadying his heartbeat. The plan was simple. Infiltrate the enemy base, disable their planetary defense grid, and hold out long enough for the other rebel groups to strike. If they failed, it would mean the complete annihilation of the remaining resistance. A deep voice crackled through the stolen Zyran communicator on Eric's belt. "They know we're coming." Eric smirked. "Good. Let them be afraid." With a single nod to Sally, he raised his fist, signaling the attack. The first explosion tore through the outer walls of the enemy stronghold, sending shockwaves through the battlefield. Within seconds, laser fire lit up the night, red and blue streaks cutting through the air like deadly comets. Eric sprinted forward, his boots kicking up dust as he weaved through the chaos. Zyran soldiers emerged from the wreckage, their weapons raised. Eric didn't hesitate. He fired in controlled bursts, dropping two before ducking behind a fallen transport. Behind him, the Rakdig army surged forward, a mix of human and Zyran warriors fighting side by side. The enemy had the advantage in numbers and firepower, but Eric's forces had something stronger, a reason to fight. Sally moved like a shadow, her agility unmatched as she dodged incoming fire. She leaped onto a Zyran soldier, using her blade to strike a fatal blow before rolling into cover. Eric caught her eye for a brief moment, and she gave a short nod before disappearing back into the battle. Eric turned his attention to the main objective, the control tower at the heart of the stronghold. If they could reach it, they could disable the enemy's orbital defenses, giving their allies a chance to strike. "Move up," he shouted, rallying his squad. They pushed forward, using the debris and smoke as cover. Explosions rocked the ground beneath them, sending dust and shrapnel into the air. The screams of the wounded and dying filled the night, but Eric forced himself to focus. They reached the base of the tower, but the enemy was waiting. A squad of Zyran elites blocked the entrance, their armor thicker, their weapons deadlier. Eric's heart pounded. This was where the real fight began. A Zyran commander stepped forward, his towering figure imposing even in the chaos of war. His glowing red eyes locked onto Sally. "Traitor," he growled, his voice filled with disgust. "You disgrace our kind." Sally didn't flinch. "You disgrace us by following blindly." The commander snarled and charged. Eric barely had time to react before the battlefield erupted into chaos. The elite soldiers attacked with precision, forcing the rebels into a brutal close-quarters fight. Eric blocked a strike from a Zyran blade, barely dodging the follow-up attack. He fired his pistol point-blank into his attacker's chest, sending the enemy sprawling. Sally and the commander clashed in a deadly dance of speed and strength. She was faster, but he was stronger. Their blades clashed, sparks flying as they traded blows. Eric couldn't help her, not yet. He had his own battle to win. Another elite rushed him, swinging a massive energy hammer. Eric barely ducked in time, the weapon smashing into the ground where he had just been standing. He rolled, coming up behind the soldier, and fired a round into the back of his skull. The enemy forces were overwhelming, but the rebels refused to fall. Humans and Zirin fought together, covering each other, protecting each other. It was something Eric had never thought he would see. But it still wasn't enough. One by one, his people were being cut down. The enemy had more soldiers, more weapons, more everything. If they didn't take control of the tower soon, they would all die here. Then he heard Saley scream. His head snapped toward her. The Zirin commander had her pinned, his blade pressed against her throat. Blood dripped from her wounds, her strength fading. Rage burned through Eric's veins. He didn't think. He acted. He sprinted forward, grabbing a discarded plasma rifle from a fallen soldier. He aimed, his hand steady despite the chaos. One shot. The blast hit the Zirin commander in the chest, sending him crashing backward. Saley gasped, stumbling forward, but Eric was already there, catching her before she fell. "You okay?" he asked, his voice rough. She nodded weakly. "We need to end this." Eric turned his gaze toward the control tower. He activated his communicator. "Everyone, fall back to the tower. We're finishing this now." The remaining rebels regrouped, pushing forward with renewed determination. Eric led the charge, blasting through the final wave of enemy defenses. The tower doors slid open, and they stormed inside. The control room was a mess of blinking lights and holographic displays. Eric wasted no time. He moved to the main console, searching for the defense grid controls. Saley joined him, her fingers flying across the alien interface. "Almost there," she muttered. Then the alarms blared. Eric turned, his stomach sinking. A final wave of enemy soldiers was approaching. He glanced at Saley. "How much time do you need?" 2 minutes. He nodded, turning back toward the entrance. "Then we hold the line." The rebels took position, their weapons ready. Eric stood at the front, his rifle raised. The doors burst open. The final battle began. It was brutal. Bullets, plasma, blades, all colliding in a storm of violence. Eric fought with everything he had, taking down soldier after soldier. Blood covered the floor, the screams of the dying mixing with the sounds of gunfire. His arms ached, his vision blurred, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Then, just as the enemy began to overwhelm them, Saley's voice rang out. "It's done." The power surged through the tower, and outside, the massive orbital cannons flickered and died. The planetary defense grid was offline. The sky above them lit up as their allies, the forgotten, the abandoned, the rebels, struck back. The enemy forces hesitated, their confidence shattered. The tide had turned. The battle wasn't just a fight anymore. It was a reckoning. The Zirin Empire and a corrupt human command had underestimated them. They thought they could erase those they discarded. They were wrong. By the time the sun rose, the enemy stronghold was in ruins. Eric stood on the battlefield, breathing heavily, his rifle hanging at his side. The war wasn't over, not yet, but tonight they had won. He turned to Saley. She was exhausted, bloodied, but alive. She met his gaze and, for the first time, smiled. Their fight wasn't over, but now they had hope. The battlefield was silent now. The smoke still curled into the sky, the ground littered with broken weapons, shattered armor, and bodies of those who had fought to the last breath. The war had raged through the night, but now, with the first light of dawn stretching across the sky, there was only the weight of what had been won and what had been lost. Eric stood at the edge of the ruined stronghold, his rifle hanging loosely at his side. His body ached, bruises and cuts covering his skin, But none of that mattered. They had done it. The enemy was defeated. The planetary defense grid was gone, and their forces, humans and Siren alike, had claimed victory against those who had abandoned them. But it didn't feel like a celebration. He looked around at the survivors, at the exhausted faces of those who had fought beside him. They had won, but the cost had been high. Too many had fallen. Too many names would never be spoken again. The battlefield had taken them, just like it had taken so many before. A movement caught his eye. Sally. She was leaning against a piece of broken machinery, her breathing slow but steady. Her armor was scared, her skin streaked with blood. Some hers, some not. But she was alive. Eric walked over, his boots crunching softly against the debris. Sally looked up at him, her golden eyes unreadable. "We made it," she said, her voice quiet. He nodded, exhaling slowly. "Yeah, we did." For a moment, there was only silence between them. There had been so many times where he thought this moment would never come. That one of them wouldn't make it. That the war would claim them like it had claimed so many before. But here they were, against all odds, against both their own people. They had survived. Sally shifted slightly, wincing at the pain in her side. Eric crouched beside her, pulling a small medical injector from his belt. He pressed it against her arm, the soft hiss of medicine filling the air. She let out a slow breath, looking at him. "Why did you save me?" He met her gaze, thinking about all the moments that had led to this. The first time he had seen her, broken and left for dead on the battlefield. The moment he had chosen to go against orders, to protect her instead of leaving her behind. Every step they had taken since then, every fight, every choice. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe because I saw someone who deserved to live." Sally stared at him for a long moment before looking away. "I never thought a human would save me," she whispered. "And I never thought a Siren would save me," he said. A faint smile ghosted across her lips. "Then we are both fools." Eric chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Yeah, maybe we are." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of ash and metal. In the distance, the rebels were gathering what supplies they could, tending to the wounded, preparing for whatever came next. This wasn't the end. The war wasn't over, but something had changed. "We can't stay here," Sally murmured. Eric nodded. "I know. The enemy might have been defeated today, but there would always be more battles ahead, more wars to fight, more people who would need them. The rebellion wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about something bigger. Hope." Eric looked back at the horizon, where the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds. For the first time in years, he felt something more than just the exhaustion of war. He felt possibility. He turned to Sally, offering his hand. "Come on. Let's see where this fight takes us next." She looked at his hand for a moment before taking it. Together, they stepped into a future neither of them had expected. A future they would fight for.